and thanks for joining us on Advancing the Cause, the podcast of IFCA International. My name is Richard Bargas. I'm the host at Advancing the Cause, and I'm the Executive Director of IFCA International. Today we're going to be talking about something called steeplejacking. Now, maybe you've heard of carjacking, never heard of steeplejacking before, and I'm the same. I hadn't heard of it before either, although I had seen what I couldn't describe as a way of taking over churches and somewhat like a hostile takeover of a corporation. I didn't know it had a name. I didn't even know that it was that widespread. It was interesting though, back in April, I was reading the Wall Street Journal and I came across an article that had the contemporary Christian music artist Amy Grant on the photo right there in the middle of the page. And it told the story of how Amy Grant had a great-grandfather who was a pastor in Nashville, and how he had established a church there in town, and how it right there in the center of the city had grown and was quite influential. And over time, they bought a good piece of property, built a beautiful building there. And then, like happens in a lot of churches, it began to dwindle over the decades and eventually got to the point where it was just a few people. A man came into the church and he befriended everybody, and then he started to become more influential, and eventually he took over the church. And so Amy Grant hears about what happened, and she starts this fight because this man brought in a whole bunch of people that worked with him. He became the pastor. He took over the assets, began to use the finances in ways that are unethical. At least that's the argument. And so Amy Grant has sought to regain control of the church property that her grandfather helped to plant. Now, it's an interesting story because it aligns with this idea of steeplejacking. How is it that some churches are taken over and they're not necessarily wanting to? And by the way, in the case of Amy Grant's great-grandfather, the church actually didn't want to be taken over by this man, and yet they were slowly pushed out, and there was very few of them left, and they didn't resist as much as they thought they could. And after a while, they just gave up. And the church to this day is closed down, still in the hands of this man who purported to be a pastor and one who felt like he had the rights to keep the building even after it was opposed. So I want to talk about steeplejacking today, this idea that churches are taken over when they don't want to be taken over. And when I started doing my research about this, the whole thing came about because I was at an IFCA regional meeting, and a pastor came to me and he said, I got a great idea for a future podcast. Maybe you could do something on hostile takeovers by bigger churches or bigger ministries coming in and kind of pushing around smaller churches and telling them they want to take them over and make their church one of their campus sites. And as I listened to that request to do this episode, I thought, this is a good thing because even before he had spoken to me, I'd encountered some of that happening in other parts of Michigan, including right here in the community that I live and where IFCA's offices are. But I'd heard of it happening in other places, in other states, different ministries, different churches or conglomerates of churches. And so I thought, we really do need to address it. Not just the fact that it exists, but how to prepare your church, how to remain healthy so that you can avoid a bigger ministry, a bigger church coming in and just kind of pushing you out and forcing you to do things that maybe you think you don't have any other choice to do. So let me talk about a couple articles that I found. I did find more than this, but really just for our purposes, I want to reference basically two articles. The first one was in churchleaders.com. The article written by David Manner was entitled Steeplejacking, a Hostile Takeover of Worship? ? This was written back in October 14th in 2024, so it's a more recent article. And in the beginning, they define steeplejacking. So let me read this for you. It says, steeplejacking is a term that describes the attempt to infiltrate, influence, and take over an existing congregation. In the corporate world, steeplejacking could be compared to a hostile takeover. It's often initiated by marginalizing what a congregation has done or is presently doing in order to coerce it into making radical changes. All right? So It could be a group, it could be a small group of individuals, it could be another church. There's a lot of things in there. Now, according to the article, sometimes this is due to a desire to bring change to a church's worship practices. I mean, there are a lot of churches that recognize, things aren't going well. Our church is dwindling in size, and we used to be bigger and we haven't changed a lot. We need to do something. And so sometimes at the invitation of that church, they bring in a new pastor, a new staff member. Maybe they invite another church that's talking to them about maybe helping them out. And it's all at the beginning good, but then it can be too quick, maybe too aggressive, or without the agreement of the church. Maybe it's just another church that has come alongside and has identified this is a weak church, this is a vulnerable church, and under the guise of us helping them, we're going to go in there and we're going to take over, all right? The congregation, after this aggressive activity has happened, whether invited or not, can often begin to feel overlooked. They feel like they're not being heard. They're feeling like they don't matter, as if their ideas don't count anymore. They're antiquated. A pastor, if he's the one that initiates this, it may be that the church has hired a pastor and the pastor has come in, and his vision may be to come in and see what's broken and fix it. And so that may be the way that the steeplejacking happens. I remember reading an article online that it wasn't one of these two articles I'm going to reference today, but they were talking about how a pastor came in and he changed the affiliation of the church. I think it was an independent Baptist church, and he put it into the Southern Baptist Convention. He began teaching doctrines that they didn't quite agree with, and then they slowly changed the doctrinal statement and all of that. So this is kind of what the article is referencing, that type of slow takeover with aggression. And when I say slow, I mean relatively slow, as in the people felt it was fast. The pastor probably felt it was slow. The more aggressive form this article goes on to describe is like a hostile corporate takeover. It feels to the people that are there, and it may be overtly stated by those that are doing the takeover, that they don't care about the history, the tradition, the practices of the former church. They just want to make it new. They just need the building. They probably don't care, at least it feels like that way. They don't care much about the people. If you go and leave, if you don't go to this church anymore, that's okay. We're going to put a lot of people in here anyways. And so sometimes this radical change of style of worship occurs, and it drives away former members. So this is all in the article. I'm not, thinking about something going on nearby, but as I even say these things, and as I read that article, it brought so many ideas of what I've seen happening in the churches around me that are being influenced by this kind of thing. And it's kind of disturbing to me. Then there's the more advanced form, I'll call it, of steeplejacking. Steeplejacking as let's call it a church planting or a church revitalization method. In Outreach magazine, they had a feature article back in 2015. So just imagine, this is 10 years ago. And if that was making the news back 10 years ago, how many churches have been steeplejacked since then? So February 14th, Valentine's Day 2015, Outreach magazine wrote about steeplejacking with the headline, "Steeplejacking Taking Over Dying Churches." The article says, at the same time, this is not at the beginning, but a little bit down from the beginning of the article, it says, at the same time, a new ministry strategy, and they put those in quotes, a new ministry strategy has emerged among the younger churches in town. Some call it steeplejacking. National ministry organizations advise local pastors to target declining congregations and overtake their properties. It's like a churchified foreclosure and eviction process as the ambitious ones attempt to acquire buildings at little or no cost. Quote, all for the sake of the kingdom, they say. The article goes on to say, once in a while, all ends well. Both the overtaking and the undertaking congregations find ways to meet their challenges and simultaneously serve their communities and honor God. They find win-win solutions. Both see their years of faithfulness, hard work, and sacrificing developing into something valuable and durable. The article goes on to show the dark side, though, and this really is what I want to focus mostly on. It says, but sometimes steeplejacking becomes an unnecessarily divisive and destructive exercise. This usually comes about when raw pride and hubris enter the scene. I've seen leaders of a young church communicate coldly with a struggling church, boast of their attendance numbers, and tout their plans to establish multi-site locations all over the landscape. They attempted to intimidate the shrinking church into surrendering their keys or, quote, face the possibility of closure. So this is what steeplejacking is. It may be an individual and it's not a plan, it's just not a formal plan anyway, or it may be a corporate church mentality where church leaders of a mega church are targeting weak and dying churches and saying, we want that property. We're going to make it our church. Or, unfortunately, sometimes they say, we want that property, and then they liquidate it by selling the assets and then using them to fund their ongoing ministry choices. So, whatever the case is, it's something that you need to be aware of and something you need to think about and even prepare for if you weren't aware that this is out there. And so I want to talk about how can our churches respond and how can they prepare for it. All right, so I have 8, I think they're helpful ways that we can respond and prepare for any threat that might come to us, that we might have our church taken over, steeplejacked, or we might be able to reverse the trend that our church is going in so that we can be healthy and strong. All right, so 8 of them. Let me give you the first one. First, maintain the health and vibrancy of the church. In other words, you won't be a threat all the time. I mean, there's always bigger churches, but you won't be as big of a threat to be taken over if you're a good, strong, healthy church. It's when we're smaller and weaker and unhealthy and the money's not coming in to pay the bills and keep the lights on that we start to wonder if we're a viable church anymore. And then somebody comes along and offers to kind of give you relief. Maybe you've been looking for a pastor. You've got tired deacons. You've got tired elders. You've got people that are just kind of hopeless feeling. And it feels like a church is going to swoop in and save the day for you. You don't have to lead anymore. You don't have to carry on anymore. You just can give it over to them and be done with it. Go find a better church, a different church. Maybe you've been looking for an out. Well, to avoid getting there, work on maintaining the health and the vibrancy of the church. Here's something I want you to think about in relation to that. Remember that church size does not equal church health. Let me say that again because it's really important. Church size does not equal church health. I had to learn this a long time ago. Is you can be a small church. As a matter of fact, most churches in America are small churches. Most churches in America are 100 or under. So don't get the feeling that if you aren't a mega church that you're not a good church or you're not a healthy church. Small churches that are faithful, small churches that are healthy is what matters. You can be a small church and unhealthy. You can be a large church and unhealthy. You can be a small church and faithful. You can be a large church and be faithful. So size doesn't correlate to health or faithfulness. Make sure your church, whatever its size is both healthy and faithful. Okay? Keep the main things to do that. In other words, sometimes we can play the comparison game with other churches, the church down the street, as if we're in some kind of competition with them. We can look at their VBS program. We can look at their sports program. We can look at what they do for their wild game dinner. We can look at what they do for their men's ministry, women's ministry, their service times, the types of music, the facilities that they have, the outreaches that they do. And we can try to figure out how can we one-up them. And that's not a good thing to do. The competition game, nobody wins in that game. So what I would suggest to you is keep the main things, especially if you're wanting to make sure that your church that is kind of struggling right now doesn't lose its focus and become unhealthy or even unhealthier. Make sure that you think about Acts 2:42, which tells us that the early church right there at Pentecost was focused in on the primary needs. Of course, evangelism isn't in the list. So let me give that up front, because that's exactly what Peter just did in Acts chapter 2, is he preached the gospel and then 3,000 souls are saved that day. So evangelism isn't listed, but it's just kind of built in and automatically assumed in church health. And that seems to be the biggest problem in dying churches, is they've forgotten or they've given up on, or they don't do it because they're being maybe disobedient, evangelism. Okay? You just will not be a healthy church if you don't evangelize. Healthy bodies reproduce. Healthy church bodies reproduce. And so evangelism. And then, of course, Acts 2:42 goes on the list: the apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread, the fellowship, and the prayers. Are you teaching the word? Are you feeding the sheep well? You know what? The megachurch, oftentimes it's self-help, pop psychology, lots of stories, lots of illustrations, lots of whiz-bang stuff. It's a big show. Not all churches are like that, but a lot of them are. And if you are feeding your sheep, a lot of those big churches have a big front door, but they have a big back door. Many of them will find their way to your church. So keep that healthy. They can be a big church with a big front door and a big stage show, big presence, and yet they aren't teaching the word of God. They're not being faithful, and in that way, they're not healthy. So make sure you're teaching the word, apostles' teaching, the breaking of bread. Of course, it's communion. It's also fellowship together with one another. It's prayer together. If you've got those things, then you've got what you need. You can build off of that, but make sure you keep the main things, and you don't miss out on what God has called us to be and to do. All right? Maintain that health. Remember that buzzards don't hover over healthy, living people. Where do the buzzards gather? They gather where there's the weak, the sick, and the dying. And so make sure that your church is healthy and the buzzards won't come around as often. And if they do, you'll have the strength to shoo them away, all right? So number one, maintain health and vibrancy of your church. Number two, maintain clean membership rolls. We've all heard of the proverbial church that has 300 on the rolls and has 25 in the pews. That's not a good thing, brothers. That's not a good thing. We want to make sure we don't have that kind of situation in our own churches. You need to sit down and as a board, as your elders, as the pastor, as the deacons maybe the whole church gets together. And sometimes it's hard for churches because we feel like it's a mean thing. It's unkind to take people off our membership rolls. But if they're not attending anymore, then they need to. Your constitution actually might require you to clean the rolls every so often, usually about every 12 months for non-attendance. If that's the case, then you've got all the permission you need, and you just need to wipe the rolls of everybody that's not on there, okay? If it's not in your constitution and bylaws, you ought to do that. You ought to put that in. You can pick however long you want as a church, but you need to have that stipulation in there. And here's why. In relation to the steeplejacking, if you have a very large church roll, where say you have the 30 people that are in attendance regularly, and I know how that works, they rotate out. You might have 100 people, but only 30 show up, and they kind of seem to rotate around, and you only get them a few weeks of the month, and yet if you had everybody in a church at the same time, you might have 100 people. I understand how that works. But say you only have 30 people, and they're rotating in and out, and you've got 20, 25 members there. But on your rolls, you have 200, say. And the majority of those churches went to a big church down the street for whatever reason. And now they've targeted you and your church to become one of their extension campuses. Well, here's the danger. All they need to do is send the former members who are still on your rolls to go down and vote on giving the property over to the church or merging or doing whatever. And they're not even there. They're not vested in it. They haven't been giving. They haven't been serving. They don't attend the church. You see, it's very easy for that kind of hostile takeover to happen because they're still considered members. So keep clean membership rolls. It's not mean. It's not unkind. If you put the rule into place and send a letter out and say, our Constitution says that you have 12 months to be in attendance. You haven't been in attendance for over 12 months. And so we just want to inform you that we are removing your name from the membership rolls. We pray that you are serving the Lord and being blessed wherever you're at, attending church, but you will no longer be a member of X Bible Church. And then send it out. Maybe they aren't going to church. Hopefully you've been in contact with them. Hopefully you know where they're at. Maybe they've moved away. Maybe they've passed away. Maybe they have gone to college and they found a church out by their school. Whatever the case may be, you need to clean the rolls, all right? Because it can be detrimental to you when you need to make a very important decision and then all these people that don't go to your church who are still on the roll show up. Number 3, make sure your constitution and bylaws are clear, up to date, and biblical. All right, let me talk about each of those 3. Clear, meaning that they are easy to understand. Sometimes we think that documents that are official documents have to be spoken in legalese that only lawyers can understand. And that's not really true. You can make things very simple and clear. If you need to connect with a lawyer to make sure that they're actually worded well so you don't have these big loopholes in there, then definitely do that. But make sure that they're clear, that they're very understandable, that everybody gets it, okay? Because sometimes a constitution and bylaw of a church looks like the building. You know, unless a church built the building from scratch and it's all the original building, most churches are piecemeal works. You build a little chapel building, build a Sunday school wing, put the youth room and remodel the basement as a youth room. Then you add an annex, and then you got all these things. And I remember in our church back in California, being up in the attic, we were looking for something and discovering a whole separate roof underneath the current roof. Not like they were built flat on top of each other. No, there was a roof line underneath with space above and below it hanging out there because 2 buildings had been built, and when they put a new roof on, they didn't want to tear up the old one. They said it doesn't hurt to put another roof right over the top of it, and so they did. So if we got a leak on the first roof, we had protection on the second roof, I guess. You find stairways that don't go anywhere, closets that don't make any sense, room design that is horrible, kitchen designs are notoriously bad. Why is that? That's because the church was just doing the best it could, and they're just patching up this and building out that, and a lot of volunteers are doing the work. Well, the same thing goes for constitution and bylaws. Sometimes people don't know how to deal with maybe a troublesome person. And so they make a rule, and then they put the rule in the Constitution. That person is long gone home to be with Jesus, and you've got 20 years back, nobody even remembers the story of why we've got this weird rule in our Constitution. Well, if it doesn't seem to make sense, then take it out. So make it clear, bring it up to date, okay? And that means that, when your church was started, if it was started anytime in the last 50 years before then, you didn't have the gender issues that you have today. You didn't have all the threats, legal threats as well, that you have today. Just some things were assumed that the Christian church would not need to deal with. It was just unspoken. The culture agreed with the church on those issues, especially the moral, ethical issues. But of course, today, there's just chaos out there. And so the church has to be wise and has to put legal wording in it. When you think about who can use your facilities, when you think about what kinds of weddings can be done, will you do any kind of unions with non-heterosexual couples, all of that. How do you even define a man and a woman? We suggest you define them genetically. But all of that's got to be put in your constitution and bylaws. And if it's not there, make sure you update it. So clear, up to date, and then finally biblical. Constitution and bylaws is not the Bible. It has to sit under the Bible. The authority of the scriptures is supreme. And so sometimes we'll find things in our Constitution and bylaws that are not biblical. And that's a great time while you're doing an assessment of your Constitution to look at it and say, is this all biblical? It's always helpful to add biblical texts as well. I know some churches that their doctrinal statement within the Constitution, when it talks about the end times, it says that Jesus is coming again in the physical bodily return of Christ, okay? But it doesn't say anything about when he returns. It doesn't speak about a rapture. It doesn't speak about a millennium. It doesn't speak about the eternal state. It doesn't say anything specifically about those. It's just kind of generic. But there are Bible verses that are attached to that section. And in those Bible verses, it specifically speaks about things like the millennial kingdom or speaks about the rapture of the church. It would be better if you spell it out, because everybody can argue, well, that's a specific interpretation, not everybody agrees. Then you're going to have some problems. But it'd be good to have it spelled out and the Bible verses so you can reference it. All right? So assess your Constitution and bylaws. If they're not where they need to be, make the corrections, make the updates. Make sure, especially when you're talking about the governance part of your Constitution, like how do you hire a pastor? How do you fire a pastor? How do you bring on elders and deacons, and what are their qualifications? And all of those very, very important things about church leadership, because the leaders are the guardians. They're the gatekeepers of the church. As you think about all of that, sometimes we've got unrealistic structure in there. You might require 8 different committees, and you have to have a chairman, a treasurer, a secretary on each one of them, and maybe they have to have 8, and maybe the pastor has to be ex officio member of all the committees, and you got a little church now. Well, clean that up, take that out. Say, we have committees as necessary or something like that. You might have a requirement for a certain number of elders and a certain number of deacons, which is problematic if you don't have qualified elders in your church or you don't have qualified deacons. You need to be able to say, this is the requirements, and have as many as are necessary, but you may need to have less because you just have a smaller congregation now. And you don't want to be stumbling over those kinds of things. So address the Constitution and bylaws. Make sure that they're right where they need to be, update them, and that will suit you well in the future. Number 4, be realistic about your situation. Be realistic about your situation. Some churches, they bury their heads. I hate to say it, but that's what happens. They bury their heads like an ostrich in the sand. And they just don't want to admit that things are going wrong, that they're not the way they should be, that there's some struggles. Everything is fine. Everything is okay. But it's not. So be realistic about your situation. Sit down with the leaders. If you're not the pastor, if you're one of the elders, or if you're a deacon, whoever it is that's in your church that's in charge of things, you need to sit down and take a realistic assessment of your current health. Do some kind of analysis. A simple one is the SWOT analysis, where you sit down and you might have a whiteboard and you write S, strengths, W, weaknesses, O, opportunities, T, threats. And then you list them out. What are the strengths of our church? Oh, we are on a very busy street where lots of people drive by us every single day. There's a brand new high school across the street, and we can reach them with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Some things like that. We are a small church, but our pastor is available to meet with anybody in our congregation that they might recommend, that they sit down with our pastor and answer their Bible questions so that they can talk to them about Jesus. Well, that's a strength that a megachurch often doesn't have. Strengths. And then weaknesses. What are the weaknesses? Well, we're on this major highway, but there's a lot of crime. We have to deal with graffiti. We have to this and that, right? Opportunities. What's the opportunities? That high school across the street is an opportunity. We have lots of other opportunities. So you think through those. And then the threats. What's a threat? Steeplejacking is a threat for a weak church. Maybe you haven't had that happen. Maybe there's bigger threats you need to worry about. So assess your church. Where are you at? And then make decisions about your future while you still have the power to do so and the clarity to do so right there in front of you. It's better to look at that and say, this is a threat, now let's go deal with the threat, than to have the threat come to you and show up as a lawyer who's wanting to sue you because you didn't deal with your constitution and now somebody's contacted you about marrying a homosexual couple and you said no and now you're getting sued. You didn't deal with it. You can do that. That's the threat, but you can deal with it ahead of time. Or what happens sometimes with churches is they keep dwindling down. They keep their head in the sand. They just act like everything's okay. Everything's okay. And then sometimes they'll get phone calls from churches and there's like 4 people. One of them is the treasurer and she's bedridden. One of them is a secretary and she's in a senior center. And then there's the son of one of the old members of the church, and he doesn't really go to church because they don't have a pastor and they haven't had one for 10 years, and they're trying to figure out, what do we do next? Can we get a pastor? Well, how can 4 people support a pastor? They have a building. We have a parsonage. Okay, that's a good start. Building needs some work. It's kind of falling apart. Got pigeons living in the sanctuary, things like that. If you wait to the point where there's not a whole lot you can do, then all of the options are taken out of your hands. You're kind of at the mercy of your situation. The circumstances are going to dictate what you have to do now. And it's unfortunate, but there are a lot of churches that don't want to assess the reality of their situation, and they wait so long that they're kind of a victim of the circumstances. Don't do that. Assess where you are now and then figure out what to do. Well, you still have some options. All right? Number 5, and this goes out of number 4, ask for help. You might be thinking, well, we have a lot of threats. We've got a lot of problems. We've got a lot of needs. It might even be, I don't even know where to start with the assessments. Okay, well then ask for help. Ask for help. If you need help with an assessment because you don't know what to do, or sometimes we're a little biased, we don't know how to assess our own church, then you can reach out to IFCA, and we have many member organizations that can help you with an assessment. The Institute of Biblical Leadership, IBL, is a member organization of IFCA, and they do assessments. They do leader assessments. They can assess your constitution and bylaws. They can sit down and meet with you. They can talk with you about changes that need to be made. They can do a church assessment. But they're not the only ones. A lot of our church extensions, our church planting agencies, also have qualified leaders that are trained to do church health assessments. Reach out to one of them and say, hey, do you guys do this? Do you know somebody that does? If they don't do it, they know somebody that does. Or reach out to us and we can point you in the right direction. So if you need help with an assessment, ask for help. But there may be other things that you need help with. You might need help with some legal issues. Ask for help. You might need some help in some other areas. Ask for help. Now, not everything is going to be handed to you on a silver platter, but we can point you to resources. We can pray for you. We can put you in touch with other people that are going through something similar and have worked kind of their way through some of those issues, and they can talk you through it. The wonderful thing about IFCA as a network is that there are so many of us, churches, individuals, organizations, that can help one another so that we can maintain church health. And you need to take advantage of that. Sometimes people quit IFCA and they say, well, it's just a magazine, or I didn't get any help. And they put nothing into it and they got nothing out of it. And then when they need help, there's no one there to help them. Take advantage of it. Ask for help. Don't be like the guy who avoids going to the doctor because he's afraid of what he might have. What's that mole that you've got there? I don't know. Have you gone to the doctor? I don't want to. I'm afraid he's going to tell me it's something bad. Well, if it's something bad, he can help you fix it. You can have surgery or take medication or something. No. I'd rather just ignore it and act like it's not there. See, that's foolish. We know that's foolish. We might do it ourselves personally, But we also wouldn't recommend it to somebody else. We wouldn't recommend it to our children, to our grandchildren. We'd say, no, you need to take care of that. And we need to think about that as far as the church goes as well. We need to go get help. And sometimes we need professional help outside of ourselves, because I can look at something and go, it looks fine, but maybe it's not. It'd be better for somebody who really knows what they're talking about to sit down with me and talk through it and go, it isn't as innocent as you think it is. We need you to work on something. Get some help in this area. So get help. Number 6, not all mergers and not all changes are bad. Now, like I said, we focus mostly on the negative, mostly on the bad, but I don't want to paint a picture that anybody coming alongside of you, anybody that says we'd like to merge with you, we can see that you're weak, we want to help you, they don't all have nefarious purposes in mind. When the church that I pastored in California was struggling, the people in our church reached out to another church to help them. And the church came over, the elders came over, they looked at the building, they talked to the people, they talked to the leaders, they looked at the area, they assessed everything, they went back and discussed it among themselves, they prayed about it, and then they contacted the church and said, we can help. Here's the plan. They laid out the plan. You know, that church sacrificed a lot to help my little church. I came along later in the process. They put me in place, made sure that my paycheck was always cut so that I wouldn't starve and my kids wouldn't starve, and made sure that we were held accountable, that we were doing the job that they had brought us in to do. And we worked and worked and worked there, and we had this constant help back and forth. And as soon as we were strong enough, they cut us loose. They didn't ask anything from us. They didn't take advantage of us at all. You know, not everybody's out there to get you. Not all mergers, not all change is bad. So you need to remember that. A lot of it is good. A lot of it is healthy. A lot of it is necessary. You know, I think about cheese. You guys remember when I was little, we'd get Velveeta cheese. I know a lot of you are cheese connoisseurs and you'd never eat Velveeta. It's like, for me, McDonald's. I don't eat McDonald's every day. I don't even eat it often, but I don't stick my nose up at McDonald's. A good cheeseburger and fries, there's nothing wrong with that. And Velveeta, I know it's not cheese. I've eaten really, really good cheese, but I love Velveeta. But I remember we get it and it's got that like silver wrap around it. It's inside of a yellow box. You pull the box top off and you pull out this silver wrap and you open it up and it's super soft. It's almost rubbery. I know it's not good cheese, but it tastes so good to me. And I remember when you'd open it, if the air would get in, the end of that cheese would get hard and it would kind of shrivel back a little bit. And you'd have to cut that piece off, but the rest of the cheese block was good. And I know that happens to good cheese, actual cheese, like cheddar, where there's some parts that get exposed, or maybe a little bit of mold will grow on the outside edge of a cheese. But you know, you can cut that off and the rest of the cheese is still very, very good. And I'm telling you that because I think that we think that change is bad, but sometimes there are areas on the church that need to be amputated. They need to be cut loose because they're killing it. Not that the rest of the church is bad. No, just this one thing needs to change, or this area needs to be addressed. Not all change is bad, okay? If you believe that all change is bad, your church's time on earth is limited. Because we have to constantly be checking ourselves. We need to constantly check our theology. We need to constantly check our practice. If you get locked down and you think that a certain era in time is the era that is blessed by God, of course, we don't live that way. We don't still have a TV set from the 1950s in our home. We don't still have the same bed. Maybe you do. The same furniture, the same wallpaper, the same carpeting. But sometimes we treat the church that way, is that nothing should change. And if that's the case, then it's not just the aesthetics of it. It's the reality of you need to understand that everything that is living changes. Everything that is alive. I have to cut my lawn here in West Michigan almost weekly because We get rains frequently, even in the summer, and then we get bright sunshine and heat, and that's just grass growing weather. And I got to constantly cut that grass. Why? Because it's alive. At our church in California, didn't cut the lawn very often. You know why? Because it was so dry there and there were so many water restrictions that the grass was basically a few sprouts on dirt, dry dirt. Even when you put the hose on that dirt, it would pool up with dust. It wouldn't even soak into the dirt because the dirt was so dry. It would kind of pool up almost like mercury on the top of this dry ground. It would take forever for it just to soak into the ground. But living things change. They change. And maybe your church needs to change. Theological change isn't what I'm talking about here. It's not an option for us, but we can sit down in our churches and we can discuss changes to non-essential things. Things like order of service, worship structure. We can change that. What about committees? Do we need a committee, or maybe we don't need it anymore? How many committees? Do they need to be ongoing committees, or could they be ad hoc where we bring them and use them and then disband them once they've met their purposes? Even silly things like, what's the difference between pews and chairs? That's not an essential. We can talk about that. What about worship styles? We can talk about that. We could talk about things like service times. How many services do we have? Do we have Sunday school and then do we have worship service, or do we flip-flop them? Do we even call it Sunday school anymore? Do we call it adult Bible fellowships or life groups or small groups or equipping hour? It doesn't matter really, honestly. But if we aren't willing to look at everything and address it and change as it's needed, it's going to show that maybe we aren't healthy because we're unwilling to address any need in our church when it comes up. So just remember that. Not all mergers are bad. It may be time for you to consider merging with another church to prolong the health and longevity of the work God has given to you. Make sure everything fits well. Do your homework. Not just about the merger itself and all the practicalities of it, but the theological implications of that merger. Sometimes it's a marriage made in heaven. Sometimes it's not. And we know how bad marriages end up. They're painful and discouraging and frustrating. And church marriages that are mergers that are not a good fit end up oftentimes in divorce, a split. Those that were part of one of the churches disband and go to another one. Don't let that happen, but not all mergers are bad. Number 7, make sure your pastor is committed to your doctrine and your philosophy of ministry. Now, I say this as a pastor who doesn't want you charging into your pastor's office and demanding things. This is not a good thing. But if you're the pastor, you need to really search your heart and say, am I still where I was when I started at this church as their pastor? Let's just be honest. We change. Again, we're living. We're studying. We're reading. Our convictions might change. And if your convictions, especially theological convictions, change, I would highly, highly recommend that you consider moving on in your ministry to a different church, something that fits where you have landed. And the reason I'd say that is because I've seen it happen over and over again, where a pastor's theological convictions change and they no longer match the church. They no longer match what he signs that he believes when he started as the pastor of that church. And there's a strong temptation to guard our paycheck. If you live in the parsonage, to guard where you live, to guard your retirement, especially if you're older. But even when you're younger, it's a temptation just to stay there and get everybody else to change. And since you're the teaching pastor, to begin teaching them your doctrine, not the doctrine that everybody else agreed to when they signed up. I tell you over and over again, I'm warning you, brothers, with love. with great love for you and great love and compassion for the church, I've seen it cause grief and church splits and all kinds of dissension. Please, I beg you, don't do it. Don't think you can move a church from its theological grounding. Just be honest. I respect men who are honest and then move on. I mean, we may not agree on the area that you have changed in. Maybe you've adopted a viable evangelical position, but it's not where the church is at. Brother, move on. Step down. Help the church find a new pastor that is in alignment with what they believe. And then move on. No grumbling, no complaining. Just move on. The Lord will bless that. The Lord will honor that. But don't work to change the church. So make sure that you, if you're the pastor, make sure that you are committed to your doctrine, the church's doctrine, and philosophy of ministry. This is the other side. This is more pragmatic and practical, is that sometimes we change our views on how ministry is to be done. You come into a church and, I don't know, maybe they've got contemporary music and you've come to the conviction that I think this needs to be maybe hymns, or maybe even more strict, no instruments, only singing scripture, psalms singing. Well, that's a radical change for your church, from contemporary music to no instrumentation, psalms only. And you may have come to that conviction by the scriptures. But I would suggest if you start floating that idea and the church says, I don't know, pastor, then again, I think you need to consider moving on and finding a church where you can pastor that holds your convictions. It might be in a whole variety of things. Just don't cause division. Don't cause a split. I'm not saying that we can't change anything in the church. I'm just saying make sure it's the church's conviction along with your conviction. And if it's the church's conviction, and I'm not just saying their choices, what color the carpet is or other silly things like that. I'm talking about convictions. If their conviction is, say that they are dispensational, this has happened many times, and you are no longer dispensational, then don't try to change them. Don't try to change them. Step away graciously. Gracious, you become post-millennial. Then go find a church that's post-millennial, brother. If you've come to the conviction where you believe that women can be elders, well, if your church is not that, and if they're in the IFCA, they're not that, then move along, brother. Move along. Don't split the church because you're introducing things that are just not acceptable in the way that they've existed. All right? Now, there are some things that are negotiable. There are things, like I've said, that are small things. They're minor things. Church service times, whether we have 2 services or 1 service or 3 services, whether we have one children's program or another children's program. Those are secondary issues. But when we're talking about the practical laying out of a philosophy of ministry, if yours has changed radically, then you need to make sure that you let the church know, this is where I'm at. And if they're against it, then you probably need to help them find a new pastor that is in agreement, and then move on. All right? If you don't know, if you're not the pastor and you don't know your pastor's philosophy of ministry, ask him for it. Maybe he hasn't thought through it. Maybe he's just adapted to whatever your church has done. That's okay. Ask him if he would be willing to write it down, or if you're the pastor, write it down. This is so helpful for the church, not just for now, but for the future. For now, it helps the leadership of the church go, where are we going? What's the vision? Because the philosophy of ministry is usually written out to say, ideally, this is where I see the church going. We have this, we do this thing, and this leads to this, and this leads to this. Like, for instance, We have a men's ministry. Here's the purpose of the men's ministry. And out of this men's ministry, we will develop potential leaders. The leaders will be developed in this way. And out of these potential leaders and this leadership training that we're doing, we're going to have maybe assistants to the deacons. They're not official deacons, but they will be in practice walking alongside the deacons so that they might be tested, as the scripture says. And then out of the deacons, we will eventually, some of them will be developed into elders. We want the elders to have been former deacons because we know they've been tested and know how to serve and live among the people. But now as the spiritual leaders, they not only know the deacon side of it, they know the elder side of it. And this is the reason why I think we start with men's ministry, because it has a funnel that eventually brings us the cream of the crop of the men who become the elders and the deacons and the teachers of the church. These are all the way that we develop them. So that's a philosophy of ministry. You might have a whole different way of thinking about it and a whole different way of doing it. And maybe your church has been doing it one way and you just never wrote it down. Why is that good for now? Because now we'll all understand what's in the pastor's mind. And we'll say, now I know why he's doing what he's doing. It takes work. I admit it. And it's not just in that area, it would be in all areas of the church. The other thing it does is for the future. For the future, what happens if the Lord takes your pastor? What happens if the Lord takes you, pastor? You're in a car accident. You become sick. Maybe the Lord calls you to a different ministry. What's the model? See, the church may be settled in and go, we love the way our pastor leads. We love the way he leads our ministry. We love the direction it's going in. And then you leave. What are they going to do? Well, they can hand to the potential candidates and say, this is what our former pastor's philosophy of ministry was. How well do you align with that? Now, he may have a majority of acceptance of that way of doing things. This is great. You might even be helping him. Maybe he's a young, fresh seminarian. He hasn't thought through all those things. He can see the wisdom of it. Maybe he doesn't always agree and you guys can talk through the differences, and maybe he has a different way of looking at it and thinking about it. And you can say, yeah, that's very good. We could go with that as well. But see, you don't know. Oftentimes when you start looking for a new pastor, you're just kind of grasping in thin air. You don't know what you're looking for. How does he preach? Does he have a nice wife and kids? What else after that? Is his theology okay? Does he sign on the dotted line in agreement with us? And it's almost like when you have an arranged marriage. The first time you meet is at the altar almost. And then you're kind of married. And you're just going to have to live through a bad marriage if all kinds of surprises come out in the wash. So a philosophy of ministry helps, okay? Make sure that your pastor, if you bring in a new pastor, that he is fully aligned without any reservations, fully aligned with your doctrinal statement. I say this because there's a lot of churches looking for pastors right now, and it can take a long time. This isn't just an IFCA problem. This is a problem throughout evangelical churches. There's just not a lot of pastors and a lot of needs. And sometimes a church can get a little desperate. You're looking and you aren't finding anything, and you might want to just take the next warm body that comes through. He's a fresh face, sounds very theological, sounds eager. He wants to make lots of changes. And you realize we need to put a new fresh coat of paint on this church, so to speak. And you hire him. You make a hasty decision because you're desperate. But again, it's like an arranged marriage. It's too late once you've done it. You're going to cause a lot of heartache and grief for yourself if you aren't careful. And some of that shows up in the doctrinal statement. Is there any reservation? Well, I don't know. I haven't really thought through that issue. Well, he's not your man. I guarantee you, if he hasn't thought through that issue and he's come all the way through seminary, then he needs to spend some more time in the Word because he's not ready to pastor a church, or he's not willing to commit because he knows it'll put him out of alignment with your statement and he really wants the job. Be careful. And make sure that when you look at that Constitution and bylaws, which the doctrinal statement is usually a part of the Constitution, that he affirms every bit of it. I unfortunately have seen some pastors that after they've taken the position, they didn't agree with it. They kind of crossed their fingers when they signed on the line, And what they ended up doing was changing the whole church's doctrine to match their own. Be very careful. Don't rush into anything, all right? If you need help, again, you can reach out to IFCA. We have a brother here in the office that helps churches looking for pastors, helps you with figuring out what do you need if you're going to put together a nominating committee, if you're looking for what are the options for candidating and how do you go about it and all of that for churches, especially a church that's had a pastor for decades. They just haven't done it before. We can help you with that. Just let us know we can help you in that area. Number 8, when a church shows up, and it's a potential steeplejacking situation, when a church shows up and wants to make you an offer, kind of like the mob, they want to make you an offer you can't refuse. Remember, it's not your church. Pastor, it's not your church. Elders, it's not your church. Congregation, it's not your church. It's Jesus's church. That means it's not up to you. It's not up to you how you feel, which, by the way, changes all the time. So if somebody comes up to you with an offer, and because the church belongs to Christ, whoever is the leaders, whether it's a pastor or the elders or deacons or trustees or committee, when churches start to decline to a point where a hostile takeover is very realistic, whoever the group is that's left needs to sit and pray and pray and pray. You need to also talk. Make sure you have a lot of discussion. I told you need to assess your situation before it gets to the point where it's a very dire one, where you don't have a lot of options. Let me tell you this. Your church may get to the point where you've got another group that's come to you and said, we want your property. Hand it to us. And we'll make sure that we take good care of it. And you may not know. Do some research into the background of this group. They may talk and say all the right things up in front, but you need to make sure that you're the ones that are going to be shutting the lights off on that church. Make sure that you're doing your due diligence. All the people that have come before you, all of them that have faithfully given, all of them that have faithfully worked, they've built that building, they've given that property, they've poured their lifeblood into that church. You can't fail them by not doing your research and making sure that when you do close the doors in the church, the assets that are left, that are distributed, are given to those who truly are worthy of continuing the work of Jesus Christ. Just because they promise you the moon doesn't mean it's going to happen. Make sure you do it. Because here's the thing, I want you to consider this. You could take the assets, and every church that's a member of IFCA has to have a dissolution clause, a clause in their constitution that says, if the church closes and the church dissolves, here's how the assets will be distributed. You can't give any to yourself. You can't split it amongst the 10 people left in the church. That's illegal. But you do usually say in that clause either specifically who you're going to give it to. So it might say something generic like an evangelical institution or organization that is in agreement with our doctrinal statement. That's great. That means that you aren't going to be able to give it to a cult or a false teacher or anything like that. And then you can choose amongst a large range of groups and split it up if you want. It might say specifically you need to give it to somebody, like you have to give it to a missions agency or you have to give it to another organization. Make sure you do your due diligence. Sometimes those things were put into place, many, many years ago. And a lot of the organizations have become apostate. And I would hate to see a church dissolve and those funds given over to some group that is teaching things that we definitely do not agree with. They've changed. So part of the Constitution and bylaws updating should make sure that the group that's in there, if you have a specific group, agency or whatever it is, hasn't become apostate, all right? But make sure you do your due diligence. We can help you if you want something like that. But when you dissolve, that money is going to go. So say your church has been there for 100 years. Oh, praise God for all the work that has been done in that place for 100 years. But there's just not enough people to keep it viable anymore. And you've got some local churches that are good, and you're going to go ahead and be members of those churches. So what do? You're the guy that's going to shut the lights off, and you're going to sell the property and disperse the funds. Well, take the money. Think about this. You can send it to a church planting agency where many other churches can be planted from the money that you gave to them. And it's almost like out of the ashes of your church rise several other baby churches. What a blessing that is. You can give it to missions agencies where they can fund people going overseas to take the gospel. And people are hearing about Christ because your church, all of the money that had been concentrated in that building now is being spread out, has been liquidated so that it can help people get the gospel out. It could be used for a lot of different things. So think about that. When a church shows up, what are they all about? They're going to buy another sound system? They're going to buy a light machine, a smoke machine? Are they going to get their pastor another new car? They're going to sell your church property and use it to buy a helicopter to do some fancy thing with their church? Look at the ministry. What are they going to do with the money? And they may be a very good church. They may do wonderful things with the money. Remember, not all mergers and not all change is bad. But make sure if they show up and they make you an offer, that it's a good offer. Because we want to be held accountable by the Lord for everything that we did, that it would be pleasing to Him in every way. If you find out that this is some conglomerate corporate church, that all they want to do is take over your building and make a franchise, a McChurch, where your church used to exist, and you're not into that, then just firmly tell them no. All the power is in your hands. All the power is in your hands. You are a local church. You are recognized by your state. And if you're an IFCA church, you can reach out to us and we'll do what we can do to help you. If you want help, we're here to help you. Call us. We'll give you counsel. We'll point you to resources and help you out. Remember, make sure your member rolls and your documents are all in order, because when they show up at your door, they might try to get around everything if you tell them no. So make sure you've got all of that in place and properly set so they can't somehow sneak in the back door and take over the church. I hope this has been helpful to you. We don't want to see any church taken over in a wrong way. We understand that every church has a lifetime, that sometimes churches die. Sometimes churches have fulfilled the mission that God has given to them. And if they've been faithful, even though they've dwindled down, that's okay. The Lord knows our faithfulness. So don't feel bad if you have to be the one that shuts the church down. But I want to warn you against those who would come alongside and befriend us, and they have different purposes in mind and might take your church property and use it either for selfish gain or to fund a ministry that you definitely wouldn't want to be a part of. I hope this has been helpful to you. If you want to know more information about IFCA International, then reach out to us at ifca.org. If you want to email us, you can do so at advancing@ifca.org. Well, my name is Richard Bargas. I'm the Executive Director of IFCA International, and I'm your host here at Advancing the Cause. Until next time, God bless. We'll talk to you later. Bye.